In the somewhat obscure but fascinating film Embrace of the Serpent, we are introduced to an Amazonian shaman, the last of his kind, and we follow the interwoven accounts of his meetings with two strangers who are both in search of a sacred plant that is said to contain healing powers. The first man who the shaman meets is old and dying, and only has one dream left, which he dreams over and over. The journey he is about to embark on will be his last. More than 30 years later, the shaman, now an old man himself, meets the second stranger, a young scientist who doesn't dream at all, and who is hoping to complete the expedition that the first stranger could not finish. Our shaman, however, has become equally disconnected. His culture and his people have been destroyed, his dreams are forgotten, and the jungle that used to speak to him now remains silent. Nevertheless, they venture out together, and eventually find the very last specimen of the sacred plant. The shaman tells the scientist, whose perspective we are now directly inhabiting. And then, he sends us away. Whenever people talk about trippy scenes or trippy movies, most often what they're referring to is an expression of psychedelia, which is the name for the specific style, vibe, or aesthetic that is used in art and in cinema to reflect psychedelic experiences. The temporary alteration of one's consciousness most commonly produced by the consumption of psychoactive substances.
I think it's gonna be fun. Ready?
Yeah, go.
Some movies portray psychedelic experiences like these directly, but there are also many others that more implicitly invoke their effects, either within isolated sequences or by employing a kind of storytelling that just feels altogether trippy. But the thing I am most interested in for the purpose of this video is the extent to which these movies also explore the deeper themes and ideas associated with psychedelic experiences. For although they are often associated with recreational pastime here in the West, the employment of psychedelics actually has a rich history in many cultures. Not only have they played a central role in traditional therapeutic rituals that we have only recently begun to rediscover, but they've also offered important insights into philosophical and neurological questions regarding the nature of our consciousness, our perception of reality, and of our sense of self that will certainly bend your mind and might just bring you back a changed person. This video was brought to you by our creator-owned streaming service Nebula, where you can enjoy all my videos ad-free and which is the only place to watch my exclusive content. Stick around to learn more about the other benefits and about the special offer that's available through my channel. First off, let's talk about the way psychedelia in movies demonstrates how psychedelics actually work. Which is kind of a tricky subject because we don't really know how psychedelics actually work. Even though Western science has been trying to understand them for well over a century, as a research paper by Link Swanson points out, significant gaps in our knowledge remain. For example, we still can't really explain why psychedelics can produce such a broad diversity of neurological effects, nor do we know how these effects are connected to changes in our subjective experience, in our consciousness. It does explain, however, why psychedelia, the cinematic representations of psychedelic experiences, can feel so disjointed and all over the place. It's because there's just such a wide variety of documented effects. For starters, there can be changes in perception, distortion, intensification, hallucination, alterations in the experience of sound and light, texture and color, that altogether invoke a sense of strangeness about the outer world, and sometimes even of one's own body. Many people also experience intensified emotions, both in the positive sense, feelings of euphoria, giddiness, awe and wonder, as well as in the negative sense, feelings of fear, paranoia, or anxiety. Then there's cognitive effects, changes in the thinking process, such as the flow of linguistic and conceptual associations, the application of logic and reasoning, and the forming of mental visualizations. Lastly, there's effects on one's sense of self, and the more rare occurrence of what is known as ego dissolution, the complete loss of boundary between oneself and the world, which is sometimes described as a mystical experience. I'll get back to this one towards the end. Although the effects of psychedelics do not necessarily point out brain functions and subjective experiences that we otherwise wouldn't know about, they do highlight some key elements that have helped neuroscientists to better understand them. Here again, however, the lack of precise knowledge also means that we haven't yet settled on one unifying theory, but contemporary hypotheses do share some commonalities. Most importantly, there's the recognition of two different forms or processes of consciousness. There's the one that constrains our sense of reality and of ourself into a relatively stable conscious experience. We can see this one as our default state, as our everyday waking life. In the entropic brain theory that was proposed in 2014, which is modeled after Freud's conceptualizations of consciousness, this is referred to as our secondary consciousness, the one that regulates or comes secondary to our primary consciousness. Primary consciousness then is the psychedelic experience, or rather the mode of consciousness that psychedelics bring into our waking presence. An experience of reality and of ourselves that is unregulated, unconstrained, and much more disordered, i.e. entropic. In other words, according to the entropic brain theory, our brain has a primary function, the indiscriminate input of external stimuli, and a secondary function, rendering that disordered input into order, into what we experience as our conscious reality. As a shorthand, we can refer to this secondary function as our ego, which also originated in Freud's psychology. Although we don't exactly use his work in the same way that we did when he was still around, the concept of the ego is still useful to distinguish the specific part of our psyche that develops as we grow older, and that restricts us based on our interactions with the world around us. The ego is a secondary process because it's the part that teaches us how to behave in a certain way, that forms memories, beliefs, values, social skills, ways of thinking, ways of acting, and as such, it's also the part of us that we generally consider to be our self, our identity. Now, one can argue that all this means that the psychedelic experience which inhibits the secondary process and thereby scrambles our perception of reality is little more than a temporary form of madness, a drug-induced departure from our quote-unquote objective reality. And to some extent, this is true, but it's not the full story. What this is not going to be, however, is some overly enthusiastic metaphysical argument about how psychedelics unveil the true nature of our reality. It's more about what it reveals about our own psychology and about the untapped potential of engaging a different mode of consciousness.
Seen from out here, everything seems different. Time bends, space is boundless. It squashes a man's ego.
To elaborate this, let's look at another contemporary hypothesis, which is called the predictive brain theory.
Now imagine being a brain. You're locked inside a bony skull trying to figure what's out there in the world. All you've got to go on are streams of electrical impulses which are only indirectly related to things in the world, whatever they may be.
The predictive brain theory proposes that the brain functions as a prediction machine that actively guesses our reality in real time.
So perception, figuring out what's there, has to be a process of informed guesswork in which the brain combines these sensory signals with its prior expectations or beliefs about the way the world is to form its best guess.
In this sense, its core concept is not unlike the one we saw in The Matrix, which also presented this idea of the brain as an interference machine between the external world and our conscious awareness.
How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
Of course, in the predictive brain theory, the input that our brain bases its predictions on obviously isn't manipulated by evil machines, but simply stems from the sensory stimuli that we receive from the world around us, and from the concepts and beliefs that we formed based on past experiences. But still, it does suggest that we are essentially hallucinating our conscious experience, and as such, it also isn't as fixed or objective as we sometimes believe it to be.
It depends as much, if not more, on perceptual predictions flowing in the opposite direction. We don't just passively perceive the world, we actively generate it.
In his TED Talk about the subject, Anew uses this example in which our brain is likely to predict that tiles A and B are a different color, even though, as he then demonstrates, they are actually the exact same shade of grey.
And if you still don't believe me, I'll bring the bar across and join them up.
This is obviously a very minor and benign example, like a tiny visual glitch in the Matrix, but it does point to deeper implications about the way we construct our ego, our sense of self, and the extent to which certain experiences, feelings, or beliefs have resulted in overly rigid predictive patterns that are now preventing us from seeing things differently, from seeing ourselves differently.
Why is it so hard for us to be happy?
In this sense, it also gives us an idea of why the occasional disassociation from these secondary processes to experience a different, a more primary mode of consciousness can be so important.
What you know you can't explain, but you feel it.
You've been feeling it too, haven't you? Something is off.
You don't know what it is, but it's there.
It's like a void. Empty but solid. Right under the surface.
There is a strange inner struggle that so many of us seem to increasingly experience in some form or another, and that so many stories are increasingly trying to define. A perceived lack of meaning, of purpose, a vague sense of anxiety, of stress.
Fuck, there's always something.
Yes, there's always something.
And although there's obviously a myriad of societal factors that play into this, oftentimes it feels like the essence of this conflict is portrayed as a spiritual matter, as the result of our increasingly secular and profane world that's been disconnecting us not necessarily from God, but from a more general and more ancient notion of engaging with what is essentially primary consciousness, some kind of regenerative energy that we can tap into for meaning, healing, and personal transformation. As authors Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette once put it, profane space has no axis mundi, no cosmic tree or pillar leading to the heavens. This is the experience of modernity, people unable to locate a center.
How did I lose you? Wandered.
Dañara David, nunca genote, iad, pugo baitañen. Tenamo unubikaite, taino nanukaite, tenahapuit.
This is also a crucial element in the embrace of the Serpent. When the first stranger arrives in the Amazon around the turn of the 20th century, he comes from a world that's been rapidly industrializing, a world that, like the stranger, is on the verge of forgetting that it is capable of dreaming. It should be noted that dreaming here is also associated with primary consciousness, with a form of experience that, not unlike the mind on psychedelics, is much more associative, visual, and unconstrained than our general waking experience, and that functions not, as we once believed, as a distorted byproduct of the information processing and regulation that our secondary consciousness produces, but instead offers, as we now understand it, a unique source of information about our inner mind and inner selves that is qualitatively different from waking thought. Anyways, this progression towards dreamlessness, towards a world out of touch with primary consciousness, seems to be confirmed by the arrival of the second stranger 30 years later who, as mentioned before, no longer dreams at all. This disconnection is reflected by the jungle around them, of which we know that it once used to be lush and colorful, that it once used to be sacred, magical, mystical, but which now appears to us in black and white, mundane and profane. a world that is completely devoid of primary consciousness. But in part thanks to psychedelic research, we can now also articulate this same conflict in more neurological terms. Because in a world that has actively dismissed the deliberate engagement with primary consciousness, that placed it on the fringes of our society from a cultural point of view, and that, in many cases, even did away with it entirely from a legal point of view, what we are left with is our ego, with the mode of consciousness that constrains our perception, emotion, cognition, and self-identity. And as a secondary process, as a mechanism that regulates, restricts, and stabilizes, it can be too rigid, and over time, it can develop pathologies that essentially trap us within ourselves, that keep us stuck in unproductive, harmful, or otherwise undesired patterns, that take our lives and our self-worth and render it conditional, make us feel like we have to act in a certain way, perform in a certain way, that we have to achieve more, do more, and be better, always, again and again, restraining ourselves more tightly, blaming ourselves more deeply, all the while preventing ourselves from truly experiencing and understanding the full breadth of our emotions, our consciousness, and our inner being, which not only disconnects us from ourselves, but which also leaves us increasingly disconnected and isolated from anything outside of ourselves too.
That's what the Matrix does. It weaponizes every idea, every dream, everything that's important to us.
And it is here that the psychedelic experience, the willful engagement with primary consciousness, reveals its true value.
Now, you must journey inwards.
Because what this does is it inhibits the brain's predictive functioning. It makes it more entropic. Or in more general terms, it loosens the brain's secondary consciousness restrictions. And in doing so, it opens our mind to a different mode of consciousness, which again does not really mean another reality, but rather another mode of perceiving reality, one that is much more disordered and chaotic, but that is also one in which we can temporarily free ourselves from the established and the sometimes overly restrictive predictive patterns so that we can experience the world and ourselves anew, that we can see things differently, feel things differently, that we can let go of everything that was keeping us small, keeping us limited, isolated, and that, in rare occurrences, we can even fully let go, if only briefly, of our ego in its entirety, to experience a state of total primary consciousness, a state of being that is unconditional, undemanding, that is free from all boundaries, conceptual, cognitive, and emotional, an experience that is all destructive, all reconstructive, in the most liberating way imaginable.
I'm going to show them a world without you. A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible.
All you wanted was to not be alone.
I see it all, and you don't have to hide, it's okay.
What all this really tells us is that the psychedelic experience, or more generally, the engagement with primary consciousness, both on the level of individual psychology as well as in the context of wider cultural practices, is about more than a momentary escape from our everyday being. It is a potential source for meaning and knowledge, for regeneration and transformation, for realigning ourselves to our own ego. One that we, especially here in the modern West, seem to have fallen out of touch with. But as transformative as an experience like this can be, it is important to emphasize that it is not a force to be trifled with. Just as we can suffer from too much constraint on our psyche, so too can we be harmed by having too little. As Robert Moore pointed out in his book The Archetype of Initiation, truly liminal space, truly transformative space, truly sacred space in the sense that tribal peoples used it for personal transformations, always has ritual leaders. And so, the point here is not that we should all be having more psychedelic experiences, but that we, as a culture, as a society, could benefit from more engagement with our primary consciousness in order to better understand and to better relate ourselves to our ego, our secondary consciousness, and our inner being in its entirety. And to do that, we need ritual leaders, we need guidance, we need support systems and communal structures that help us to venture into our primary consciousness in a way that is healthy and constructive. This, I think, is what psychedelia and cinema is ultimately really about. It's not necessarily about the act or the aesthetics of doing psychedelics, but about opening ourselves up to this broader awareness about the functioning of our mind and of ourselves, and about how we can navigate it in a way that doesn't just send us into the void, but that also brings us back. Before fully settling back into reality, let's take one more trip, because I want to show you a place where you can experience my work in its purest, most primary consciousness state. And that place is our creator-owned streaming service, Nebula. There's a lot to talk about here, but I'm gonna try and keep it brief. So, here's 3 reasons why you need Nebula in your life right now. Reason 1. You get instant access to exclusive videos of mine that you cannot find anywhere else. In fact, there's exclusive videos from a bunch of creators like Thomas Flight, Jacob Keller, Lindsay Ellis, and many more. Reason 2. You get instant access to my Nebula class, a deep dive into the nature of storytelling and into how stories function as vehicles for meaning, capable of transforming our lives for the better. Reason 3. Besides getting every episode a week early, you also get instant access to the exclusive bonus catalog of Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that I host together with Thomas Flight. So far, this bonus catalog features exclusive discussions on Fight Club, Beef, Babylon, Avatar: The Way of Water, All Quiet on the Western Front, Upstream Color, and many, many more. Reason 4. I'm sorry, I thought of another one. You get to enjoy all of this completely ad and sponsor free. Every video of mine has 2 separate cuts, one that goes up on YouTube with the sponsor segment that you are watching right now, and a special Nebula version that has no such intrusion and that just lets you experience the whole video in peace. And reason 5, last one I promise. Being a creator-owned streaming service, a third of your subscription fee goes directly to me, and so signing up to Nebula is also a great way to support my work. Be sure to use my personal link, which lets Nebula know that you came over from my channel and which gives you a nice discount. That's go.nebula.tv/LSOO, or just follow the link in the description to become a proud supporter of our amazing platform today.
Now you are an empty heart, open to receive your true essence, your own perfection, your new body, which is the universe. You will be born again, you will be real, you will be your own father, your own mother, your own child, your own perfection. Open your eyes, you are the earth, you are the green, you are the blue, you are the others, you are the essence. Look at the flower, look at the flower. For the first time, look at the flowers.